I'm going to really show you how to identify fish and what sort of things you need to think about when you're looking at a fish and wondering what on earth it is. So really, it's giving you the right mindset, and then some of the tools, and then it's up to you to go out and develop your own tools and hone them to your requirements. I mean, I started off thinking I need to know what a Couch's goby looks like, for example. And there's a really good population of those in Loch Eyne. And we know that they're there. Before that, we didn't really know where else they were. So you could be looking at a fish and you couldn't be sure, was it Couch's or not? So 5 of us spent a week in Loch Eyne photographing gobies. And then after 5 days and more than 500 photos later, we felt we'd got it sorted, but that was just one species. So that's, you know, quite a big commitment in time to begin to get anywhere. So hopefully I'll give you the right mindset and the right tools and some of the tools, and you can go and find your own and refine those. As John went through quickly last time with in the photo ID session, what do we need to look at to know what a fish is? How many fins has it got and how they're arranged? Its lateral line, is that curved, straight, got humps and bumps in it, got tooth or hooks or something to identify that? What shape is its tail? Is it sort of fish shaped like this one, or is it long and flowing, so to speak? Or, you know, how close does it come to the back of the fin here? And are these fins lined up with the fins underneath? Has it got any distinctive markings or colours? This one here has obviously got a big black spot in the middle of its side there. Some of the fins modified, like with the gobies, they'd have a kind of sucker here. These 2 fins are fused into a way to hang on to rocks and things. What's its mouth like? What does it feed on? Has it got a little tassel here? Is this jaw extended out in front of the top one? Its eye, how big is its eye in relative to its head? Where is it on its head? Is it sort of down the side like it is here, or sat more on top? Is there any distinctive texture on the animal? And of course, when you look at all of this and underwater, if it was me, I'd probably manage possibly 1 fish on a dive. So if you've got a camera, do use that. And just keep it in mind as you're looking at these fish, what kind of characters you might need to identify them. And then try and get photographs or drawings that show you what you're looking at. So this interesting little animal turned up fairly recently on the east coast of England, and it was posted on Facebook. And what have we got? The immediate thing was obvious, it was not in the book. So, right, what next? It's obviously got 2 dorsal fins. One fairly long one that goes back nearly to the tail. And this funny little one at the front here that looks like something like a little crown with probably three spines. Looks fairly flattened, possibly with its eyes on top of its head, maybe. Not easy to see in this photograph. Texture of the skin, this one looks kind of lumpy, warty up here. The gill cover is quite distinctive. It looks very bony and hard with quite a big spine on it here. It's got a huge pectoral fin, relatively large pectoral fin. And it's got quite a substantial tail that might possibly be oval. It's difficult to tell from this. So you agree that that's not a wondrous picture of a fish. But I think you've got quite a lot there to work on. How big is it? Absolutely no idea. My guess is it might be 25 centimetres from the way it's sat in that sort of tank. I don't know. So that's a bit of a question mark there. We have got a front picture of it. It's flattened. I don't know why it's all scribbled on here. Somebody writing on my images. The eyes are forward facing and rather small in relation to the head. And there seems to be different types of texture. There's shorter, spiny, hairy bits of skin on the top, and then something maybe more fleshy under here beneath its mouth. And there might be two tiny little nasal tubes here. So we've got quite a bit to work on, but we haven't got a picture in the book of the Irish or English fishes, so where next? Quite a good place to start, I think, is the Fish Watch forum. It's got an identification tool. It's basically, it is in French, but there is an English version of it if your French isn't up to Fish ID. But this identification tool here is really very useful. So the first question they ask you, what shape is your fish? Has it got, how many fins has it got? What shape is it? Eel-like, flattened like a flatfish, funny shape like a, say, I don't know, John Dory or a triggerfish or something. And then sharks, skates and rays at the bottom. So we decided our fish had 2 dorsal fins, so we can select that one. And then the second thing we've got to decide is what is it, where is it likely to be living? Just looking at that rather flattened fish, I think I'd probably start with bottom dwellers as the first pass on this one, rather than bottom swimmer. It doesn't really look like a fish that'd be swimming around too much on the bottom. So we've got something with 2 to 3 dorsal fins, and it lives on the bottom. And then if we continue that on the website, we've got a choice of fish with 2 dorsal fins. And some of these, come on, back we go. Some of these we're quite familiar with, like the poggy, cod family fish, scorpion fish, dragonets, gobies, anglerfish, rockling. They've all got essentially 2 dorsal fins, though some of these rockling, they're pretty, you may just be a single spine on some of these. So then in the conversation on Facebook, we had a discussion as to what it might be. One suggestion was these bullheads, sea scorpion type fish. Fins, it's got 2 dorsal fins. They don't look quite right for the one we had, but a much longer second dorsal fin. This one's large pectoral fin. It's got a spiny sort of face, big eye on the top of its head. That could be plausible, perhaps. Another idea was these scorpion fish. Tail shape looks about right. It's got a nice big pectoral fin. It's got a really spiny cover to its gills and everything. Its eyes on the top of its head, probably a bit quite well textured as well, but it's only got 1 dorsal fin. So that's not particularly a good idea necessarily. And then another one was somebody suggested a sea snail. That's only got 1 dorsal fin. It's got a rather silly little tail compared with what our fish had, which was something more like this. Pectoral fin, yes, that's big, but it's also confounded by being connected up to the pelvic fin under here, so that doesn't look quite right. The gill cover looks rather smooth. It's got a rather small eye in proportion to its body. And there's no indication that there's any texture on this fish. So that one's not so good. And then the conversation continued. And the suggestion was it might be one of these, a toadfish possibly, which looks hopeful. Nice long dorsal fin, good tail, huge pectoral fin. Different types of texture, the fleshy flaps under the chin here, and something more texture up on its cheeks on here. Relatively small eye on the top of the head. And it looks like it probably's got a pretty spiny, tough, spiky gill cover. So we've got down to toadfish from something we haven't eaten. It's not, certainly not in the Irish or English fauna. So where next? I usually start with FishBase if it's something I really haven't got a clue about. But you do need some way of getting into FishBase. It's very difficult to go in there with just not knowing anything at all. So if we just choose toadfishes, you come up with 9 possibilities. None of them, of course, are actually in our waters. And of this lot, my preference was for this hairy toadfish here, which is recorded from the Eastern Atlantic. And then having got down to your family or your species, do go a bit further and read, you know, where it lives, what its habits are. Does it really fit what you've got? And then obviously the distribution of this one's way out, but I think the animal was in a very wrong place for it. So the best we could do was come down to some sort of toadfish. But what was it doing in the waters off Norfolk? Was it an abandoned aquarium pet? And at the end of the day, you may never be actually sure what it was at all, in which case you can't really record it. But I mean, that might, you know, that's a way of tackling something that you really haven't got a clue what the animal is. So if you want to go to a technical fish ID guide, I think you throw up your hands and say, I don't do fish. You need to count the scales along the lateral line. You've got to count the rays in each fin. You've got to look at the head and see what kind of patterns of the sensory canals it's got. You probably need to stain the animal for that. You'll certainly have to have the dead animal. You'll then need to dissect it and count the number of vertebrae. So that's obviously no use at all to us lot working in the field. And then if you look at Fries's Goby, this is the official Goby's description. And I think you'd agree that if you saw that, you'd throw up your hands and, you know, maybe even driven to looking at seaweeds instead. So you've got to look at all this lot. And the fact that you've got a dead animal means all this is probably not quite accurate either. You know, fawn, fish, golden yellow spots. And I think that's something you do need to bear in mind if you're looking at a lot of books, that the original descriptions particularly were made on dead fish. And once a fish dies, of course, its colour changes drastically, as I'm sure you've noticed when you've caught pollock or mackerel or something like that. So this is the Goby that we were looking at on this page here with all these various details. And in terms of the Irish fauna, that's a very distinctive Goby. So, you know, there's not really much difficulty once you've seen the live animal to know you're sure that you've got it. But do notice that the animal's not fawn coloured. It's a steely blue. I've seen frozen samples of these and they definitely do turn fawn, but they still have these very distinctive yellow spots. And the other important thing about this fish here is this very long spine. This is a male freeze goby. Who's adding graffiti? I can guess. And this spine really is quite interesting in terms of the description that comes next, because if you look at, there's a huge misinformation timeline on what this freeze goby looks like. This is the first drawing of one by Holt and Calderwood from a site in Galway Bay, I think. So that was the original drawing of it. It was a male fish, this one, and you'll notice that it hasn't got the long spine. If you then go to Travis Jenkins' book on Irish and British fishes, he produced a copy of Holt and Burns' drawing from of the Irish gobies. And you'll see here, this is shown as a male fish, but it lacks the long spine. But you continue this through for nearly 90 years. Wheeler got it right. He's got the long spine for the male fish. The Lithgows reverted back to Holt and Burns' picture. Maitland and Hurdson got it right, but then they should have done because they were using Wheeler's drawings anyway. But the really interesting thing I found was that in this book on the European fish fauna, the drawing reverts to Holt and Burns' original one. But this picture, which is one of Paul Kay's, and I actually know the picture, you can see in the photograph that this long spine is actually there. So despite having a fish with the right fins on it, the drawing produced in the book is incorrect. So I think you need to bear that in mind, that if the book may not, or the guide on the internet may not be correct, and you need to be very careful that you've actually checked that you've got that animal, and don't necessarily rely on just one picture, one photograph. Talk to people, try to find different images. And another thing I think people do get very hung up on is the colour of fish. First thing to think about is, well, from the fish's point of view, how old is it? Is it adult, juvenile, breeding? What mood's it in? Social interactions, breeding again, breeding status, male, female. What habitat is it in? And is it stressed? I mean, the fact that you're there might be stressing it. And certainly I've had small gobies in aquaria, and they look quite different from anything you ever see in the field. They never look, quote, normal compared with what you'd be looking at on a sandy bottom or in the rocks or something. So don't get hung up on fish colour. And then, of course, when you're underwater, how do you see it? We all, as divers, know the effect of water in terms of what available light we get and what reflected light we then get back from the animals we're looking at. You can cast your mind back to that big pink mouth wrasse at the beginning of the talk. Those pink lips and fins, if you don't actually have a light to look at them, you'd never know they were there. So though it looks very distinctive when lit, underwater you'd easily miss that. So I would suggest that you need to take a torch if you want to identify fish. It's an example of how things change drastically with age. Red mullet, this is an adult red mullet. Very distinctive fin here. This is quite a useful character. And of course, you've got the red body and these tentacles at the front for burrow whiffling through the sediment. So the next one stage younger, you've still got your black fins, but the red colour's gone completely. You've got this very distinctive red line through the fish. You've still got these feeding antennae and tentacles, what do you call them? But then these ones completely flummoxed us for a while. They're actually juvenile red mullet, and there's not a great deal there that might suggest a red mullet. They've even moved into a different habitat. They're near bottom feeders rather than being on the bottom feeders like these other two stages. But you can still see this red, this black and white fin, the same markings on it. But I've seen these in sort of shallow lagoons. I mean, this Bob Tompkins lives on Jersey. So these were in those shallow lagoons on those huge flats out to the south there, in very shallow water, but in a very different habitat to the adult fish and this sort of intermediate animal. So if you look at age again, painted goby, we're all familiar with that one, probably as divers, even snorkelers. Really good character for this goby are these speckles, particularly on the first dorsal fin. Because even if they're very young ones, like here, you can still see speckles on the first dorsal fin, and you've still got that rather cheeky, fat little face at the front, which I always think is very indicative of a painted goby. But then these little divils actually spend the first part of their life as mid-water fish, very often alongside young two-spot gobies. And I particularly noticed this picture is from Loch Eyne, because there in the Galeen there's great hordes of young two-spot gobies and painted gobies, you know, late in early autumn. So again, these fish look very different. They're even in a different habitat. So it all complicates your ID, of course. And then social interactions and, you know, time of day. Lots of fish put on pajamas when they go to bed. This is a black goby male. Again, from Loch Eyne. It's very handy there. It's so easy to organise a night dive, and you're not usually going to be too wrong, even if you get a bit lost. The female black goby, again, looks very different from the normal black goby. All in their pajamas at 10 o'clock at night. And painted goby, again, looks very different. These big patches of pale coloration, but still you should be able to make out the sort of speckles, particularly on the first dorsal fin. So that should give you, and it also the fat little cheeky face. What mood are they in? This was quite an interesting little exercise. I was down at Cahadaniel in Kerry, the muddy little harbour there at West Cove. And I was watching this male black goby, who obviously was defending a hole behind him here. You can see in this photograph, he's actually almost, I don't know, serenading somebody, certainly shouting. Because a lot of these gobies do actually make a lot of sounds underwater, particularly when they're interacting with other species, other individuals of the same species. So he's trying to call in a female here, I think. Then in this photograph, the female's just popped in under the stone there into the nest he's created. And he's looking aggressive because there were other black gobies around at the time. And then, of course, I spooked male goby. He immediately changed colour and he shoots in underneath the hole in with the female. So this whole sequence probably covered less than, I don't know, 5 minutes. So you've got a normal looking black goby to a black goby in breeding colours to one that's just had a fright. So this terrific colour change just in a very short time in one animal, one individual animal. And then during the daytime, of course, I suspect if you're familiar with black gobies, you'll recognise this one. This is a a proper male, because there's some sneaker males that kind of cheat on other males. They can sneak in behind a male that's guarding a nest and actually fertilize eggs and then leave this parental male to do the looking after of everybody's eggs, both this parental male and the sneaker. Black gobies, I think one useful character, especially on photographs, of these black lines of black papillae. That's quite a useful character to tell these ones apart from other gobies. Particularly along the top here, they sometimes show up well in photographs. Breeding status, Bayon's wrasse, which it'd be nice to get more records from the west of Ireland. There's lots of them in Kilkieran Bay. And I think we had them in Salt Lake, I can't remember rightly. So this is an adult male. It's guarding this enormous nest here. They're very characteristic nests. You often see the nests without the fish. And it was interesting at this site because there were several fish around, and there was a much smaller Bayon's wrasse. And when this large guy had cleared off for a short while, the small one put on his pink dress and these nice longitudinal stripes and paraded up and down in front of the nest. But as soon as the big male reappeared, the other fella turned off his pink and went into the ordinary sort of black stripes like this. So the changes in colour can be almost instantaneous and depend very much on, what the fish, how its mood. You can tell these small ones, they look a bit like corkwing wrasse perhaps, but they've got much more distinctive dark stripes. And if you get one with its fin up, like this one's obliged nicely, it's got a dark spot there at the base of the soft dorsal fin. And that distinguishes it from the corkwing, because the corkwing will have stripes, not quite so obvious, and it will certainly have this black spot. But you notice the black spot's not showing on this big male on the nest. Tompots and red blennies, I had trouble with them, especially on the Aran Islands, because for some reason, tompot gobies on the Aran Islands are the most brilliant red that I've ever seen. I've never seen them like this anywhere else. This is on Inisheer. Magnificent animal. I think tompots tend to have more square faces, rather squarer faces than the red blenny. And my feeling is a tompot should look like this, at least they do in Dorset. I don't know. They shouldn't be that brilliant red, but, so this is the same, I'm assuming, could be wrong, the same species as this little fella. Something that people sometimes pick up on is this blue spot on the juvenile tompots. That's quite typical, but I think it's lost in the bigger fish. This one's probably, I don't know, 5 centimetres long, but I feel that's a more usual tompot colour perhaps. Whereas if you go back to the Portuguese or red blenny, they're quite distinctive red fish. I think we saw this one last week when we were talking about the photographic ID. And certainly the red blenny there were pictures of the red blenny all up and down the west coast of Ireland. It was some time before it was actually decided that they were looking at the Portuguese blenny and red tompots. So that took a bit of sorting out. And it really started with the Biomass Ireland survey when they had done quite a lot of survey work up and down the west coast there, where these animals, the Portuguese blenny is quite common on those really exposed rocky shores. But then of course you've got male red blenny and you've got the female red blenny. So again, where are we going? That way? Yes. Completely different coloured animal, almost greenish, I'd have said. So, you know, be careful with colour, and do look at more than one image of the, once you've decided you've got a red blenny, try and look at several pictures and decide, really convince yourself that that is what you're looking at. Breeding status, again, we're going with the corkwing. I'm sure we've all seen corkwing. This is a male guarding a nest. You'll notice that the corkwing nests tend to be stuffed with seaweeds, particularly coralline algae. They're very fond of those. Whereas the Bayon's wrasse tends to use a lot more sand and gravel in among the weeds, so they look quite different nests. So even if you don't see the fish, you can very often tell which wrasse you're looking at or might be looking at. And this is just a juvenile corkwing sort of fish you might see in the seagrass beds and, you know, in the shallows at the end of the year, end of the summer. So they're a very different looking animal to this one with the brilliant green stripes on his head. This one looks a bit like the young Bayon's wrasse, but it's not quite so darkly marked. And it's got a very prominent black spot at the base of its tail. And if it was obliging and showed its fin, it wouldn't have that spot there. So, you know, strong stripes. Not such strong stripes, rather, as the Bayon's wrasse. But they can be quite, you only need a glimpse of it, and, you know, it'll tell you which one you might be looking at. And then, of course, cuckoo wrasse, we've got the two different colour morphs, females, orangey females, bright blue, dominant top male. And then the ultimate stressor is death. And I think you need to bear this in mind, especially if you're looking at some of the older books, you know, the ones end of the 19th century, early 20th century ones before underwater photography became more widely used. And of course, people like Holt and Byrne only had dead fish to work from. Their artist only had dead fish. I feel that this picture here is somewhat reminiscent of this moribund animal that I found once in Loch Eyne. You know, it's fairly mud coloured. Some of the colour retained in the fins. Then if you find rock goby in the field, you know, it's a very different animal. It's nicely mottled. It's got its nice cheeky face again, another one with a cheeky face. And this one's probably a juvenile or a female, so it lacks this very dark orangey, yellowy line across the top of the first dorsal. So if you go on to flatfish, looking at a top knot, this is a picture taken from Yarrell's History of British Fishes, published in 1886. All done by woodcuts, these things. His drawing shows quite clearly the one dark spot at the back here, which we'll see in a moment is quite characteristic of this species. And you might possibly think there's a hint of a couple of spots here. But if you'd actually find one of these beauties in the field, you know, they're magnificent animals and are instantly recognisable, I think, because got a nice spot here with a pale coloured centre. Whereas if you go back here, it's completely black with no contrast at all. And the other very distinctive character with this little fish is this distinctive V on the body here with the two circular black spots. And you'll agree that that animal is much more informative than this unfortunate creature that had been probably dead for days. I mean, they didn't have any other way of doing it, so you had to resort to fin ray counts, lateral line, scales, vertebrae, that sort of thing. But You don't necessarily have to have the dead fish in your hand or the dead bird on your plate to know what you've got. And again, here's another example of this top knot with that nice spot at the back with the pale center, V, and these two eyes on either side. And again, you can see how important the habitat is in terms of how that fish decides to colour itself. It's a pretty good match, and I bet you there was quite a lot of pink encrusting algae in the habitat as well, so it just thought pink would be a good addition. The other thing you have to remember is fish haven't read the books, and we don't know all about fish, so you need to be careful when you're talking about habitat, because very often people think of rock gobies as being sort of intertidal almost, and very shallow subtidal fish. But they're certainly, I found them down to 25 meters. So just bear that in mind, that they haven't read the book. And this image here is quite a useful one for the, where are you? There. These silky rays here that help you distinguish this one from Cooch's goby and black goby, these individual rays. And you don't necessarily have to have a DSLR, you know, with 50 megapixels or whatever to see this. I mean, I've got images which I'll show you later from compact cameras that are more than adequate to show this. And again, I think he's got a rather cheeky little face with, you can see the dark orange stripe. It's probably a breeding male, early summer dive that was. Again, habitat and fish colour. This is a reticulated dragonet, nice black sand with shell sand with mix of black stone in it. Animals matched it nicely. A more stony habitat, different colouring, good match again. Add a bit of pink merle, some more shell, the fish adds pink. But all the images have got this distinctive jigsaw mark on them here, which tells you it's a dragonet, reticulated. This one here, I think possibly you can make out this half first dorsal fin there is black. We think that's quite a good character for the reticulated dragonet, which is actually the most common dragonet that divers will see. Because the one that people call the common dragonet, I think, lives mostly on sand, and divers tend to avoid sand because it's boring. Actually, I think some of the best pictures I've seen of male dragonets have been done by Sue Daly on Jersey over a sand habitat, where she had displaying males. But just bear in mind that the huge possibilities for variation in fish colour. Another thing which I think can be quite a useful character is behaviour. Because we come back from a dive on sand, and somebody said there were some really weird dragonets there. They were behaving in a most peculiar fashion. You know, they were dashing off and then just disappearing into the sand with a little, you know, little flick. And I thought, that doesn't sound really like dragonet behaviour. What might the possibilities be? Dragonets do very, very quickly into sediment, but not as quickly as was described. So you can see this reticulated here is shuffling itself down, but this process takes, I don't know, 20 seconds or something. So I asked the chap to send me his pictures, which he had some very good ones of. No, that way. And it turned out to be a lesser weaver fish, which made really good sense because they're absolute taskmasters at just skittering out of a bit of clean sand like this sand here. And then the next you think, oh, I'll just grab a picture of it. And before you can even pick up your camera, the animal's disappeared. And if you didn't see where it went, you'd never see it again, but it just leaves its two eyes and its snout. But it was just the behaviour of that, the way it behaved, which told me it wasn't a dragonet, and I needed to think a bit further as to what it might be. Cooch's goby, anybody on the west coast of Ireland or the south coast and right up to Mulroy Bay should be looking out for this animal. There are relatively few records on the Irish biodiversity maps. After 5 days in Lough Ine and 500 images later, I reckon I can do Cooch's goby at the moment in England or Ireland. Obviously, if you go somewhere abroad where you've got 80 species of goby instead of 20, that would be a very different story. But here, unless we get some foreigners coming in with climate change, it's quite a distinctive animal. If you had the original image, you'd be able to see that each of these little fin rays up here tipped in black. The animal's a nice silvery grey, and it's got lots of spots down here, probably more than 8 kind of big blotches down its flank. Most easily confused with female or sneaker male black gobies. I always think black gobies are slightly heavier in the chest region. They've got fewer spots down here. And then usually you can see the black papillae, certainly on this one, in the original image, if you could zoom in at all the pixels, you'd see the black papillae along the top here. And you'll never see those in the Cooch's goby. They obviously have them, but they're not coloured distinctively black like they are in the black goby. And of course, their faces are very different. Head-on view of a Cooch's goby here. This black spot in its armpit's quite distinctive. And this much chunkier black goby, different kind of shaped head. And then there's further detail of the fins here. You can see the tips of the first dorsal fin rays are black, whereas they aren't in the black goby. The black goby has much longer fin rays. It's very widely distributed in Ireland. I mean, we've known about the population in Lough Ine for a very long time. And then I found one in a population in Kenmare Bay, near Sneem and Carthdaniel, West Cove. You know, this was an interesting record because I was looking through Erling Svensson's pictures of fish from Norway. And he had one labelled rock goby, done by his brother Rudolph, from Dingle. And it was definitely a Cooch's goby. So that gave that spot there. There's lots of them in Kilkieran Bay. If you go and dive Albury or somewhere like that, they're everywhere. They're as common as the black goby, I reckon, there. And then in Salt Lake, there's masses there too. And the most furthest north, obviously in Mulroy Bay, which is another sheltered site. I was surprised I didn't find them in Kilkieran Bay. Not Kilkieran, what do I mean? Killary Harbour. And then up here in Belmullet, I'd have thought there were suitable sheltered habitats for them. So you need to fill in the gaps. Over to you. If we're going on with the goby theme, there's the little goby problem. Obviously, they're the juveniles of other gobies like Cooch's and blacks. And then you've got this other genus, Pomatus, which includes the painted goby. They're quite distinctive little animals, as I've pointed out. Norwegian goby I think you can tell it that one fairly well. It's not very common. But then these three, the common goby, the Sangoby, and the Zarnois goby, are very tricky to tell apart. And sometimes it might be best, if you're recording, say, for Seasearch, to call them command gobies, perhaps, common or sand. Common goby, I think, tends to be in shallower water, possibly more tolerant of estuarine conditions. And these two, who also interbreed, I think, which makes life difficult, tend to be in deeper sort of sandy habitats. Painted gobies, you know, fairly unfussy. It'll be sand, mixed ground, that kind of thing. These guys tend to be on finer sediment. But the Norwegian goby, I think, is fairly distinctive. If you really want to go into it, you can look at, and you can do this with the good photographs. You can see where the scales actually come, so you can kind of work out what, you know, which fish you might have, depending on where the scales come relative to the head. That's quite, needs a bit of thinking about that one, and looking at some pictures at a really fairly high scale, high magnification. So this is a sand goby, so it could be Minutus or Lizarnoi. Distinctive thing here is this blue mark. It's obliging and show their fin. This blue mark's out at the edge of the fin. You can see on this one that the scales go right up to almost in front of the gill cover here. You can zoom in on that image. You can see the fin, the scales right there. So you've got either one of those two if the scales are coming up to the front at that point. But remember, I can't find any way of distinguishing these two. People in Holland have done quite a lot of work on them, but I think there's been confusion with animals that have been dead, or, you know, and when if they hybridize as well, the whole thing gets too muddled. So I'm just leaving them as sand gobies. They look a very different fish from the front end of a painted goby. Here's the painted, nice little spots down the dorsal fin. This one's a fairly orange looking one, you know, so just don't get too hooked up on colour. But some characters, this one, the speckles on the first dorsal for this guy. And obviously the eyes very much more on the top of the head than they are for some of the other sand goby types. This one's a male guarding its nest, and you can clearly see here, I think, depends how grotty the stuff is by the time it reaches you, but behind this you can clearly see diamond-shaped scales. And on top here, doesn't look as though it has any scales, so that confirms it's a painted goby. You can see that anyway. It's a male guarding a nest, so he's in full nuptial dress. Beautiful colours on the first dorsal here. This is a common goby. It's got a slightly less sneaky looking face, I feel, than the sand gobies. I always think look a bit kind of, I don't know, suspicious kind of fish. These look more jolly. And if, you can't tell on that one, but the little blue spot should be right down at the base of the fin there. But they live in different places, and when they're behaving and you watch them, they look different. That's not a very helpful description, really, is it? Anyway, here we've got back to the sand gobies. Very often they look fat and shiny, especially in some of the Scottish sea lochs, these big, fat, shiny ones. I wonder if they mightn't be Lizarnoi's one, goby. And then, of course, in the background here, you've got a painted goby showing off to us, the sand goby, I assume. Norwegian goby, I've seen them in Scottish sea lochs, and I'm sure you ought to have them on the west coast of Ireland there. They're much skinnier gobies. They've got a kind of rusty kind of tint to them, much slimmer. They've got black spot there under the first dorsal and one at the back end there. And you always seem to, I've only ever seen them on these sort of muddy sediments. You can see it's very muddy. It's got burrowing brittle stars in it and a scum of dirt and film, very muddy habitat. And they tend to be fairly deep, you know, they're, I don't know, below about 12 metres, I'd have thought, on a muddy habitat. Certainly in sea lochs in west coast of Scotland, like Loch Nevis and Loch Hourn, that's the kind of habitat I'd expect these guys in. And then, of course, there might be things coming your way, or are they already here? I don't know if you've had records of this fish, the ring-necked blenny. We're getting them much more in Dorset now. They've been spreading from Plymouth in the last probably 10 years. So this is a breeding male, like a tom pot. It's actually guarding a nest in this wreckage here. So it's in a you know, ventilating a nest like the tom pot does. This year in Dorset, we've been seeing lots of the juvenile one of this, a very distinctive little fish. Nice, distinctive brown stripe, and quite active. I'd have thought if you haven't got them already in Ireland, you could quite well be having them along soon. And then if you look at things that live on fish, in Dorset particularly, we've been getting many more of this fish louse, Anilocra. You can see it here on a gold cinny. There's a large female and a small male next to it. And we've been getting these in Dorset, I guess, in the last 20 years, I'd say they've been increasingly common. They used to occasionally find them on wrasse under Swanage Pier, but now you go into any seagrass bed locally in Dorset for sure, and certainly on the Channel Islands, you'll see a lot of wrasse. All of these guys, cuckoo, ballan, rock cook, hawkwing. They've also been recorded from black bream and sand smelt, and also the early stages of this one grow up on painted gobies and two-spot gobies. So the smaller forms start on the smaller fish, and I think they then probably migrate up onto bigger fish. And then in Ireland, of course, Dave McGrath has recorded this other fish louse, but it seems to be mostly on sort of mid-water fish, like mackerel, mullet, sea bass and whiting. And this one's never been recorded on the wrasse or gobies, as they were, at least in England. I think David's was the only record from Ireland that they had. So I think that's something worth looking out for, and quite distinctive if you see it. And a sort of, just if you are photographing fish, you will be, in order to identify them and obviously back up your records. Do you have a thought for, you know, the effect of having multiple flashes on fish? You'll know what kind of images you're going to need of your fish in order to identify it accurately. And as John showed the other week, you don't necessarily have to have all the features in one image. But do keep in mind that fish can't shut their eyes. And if you're taking 10 to 20 images, you know, try that yourself, keeping your eyes wide open. I mean, you'll be seeing stars for literally hours afterwards. And it always worries me a bit when somebody shows me, you know, 15 or 20 pictures of the same fish with the more or less the same stance. You know, just take a few pictures and then move on. And if there's another one, you could take a different angle, perhaps, if that's what you need. So don't overdo it. And then as a parting shot, sometimes I hear I can't photograph fish, my camera's not good enough. Well, I use a compact camera for epic snorkel journeys, just because they're more compact, and I find they're perfectly suitable. And after all, if you've got all the bells and whistles in a DSLR worth thousands of euros, but it's in the wrong hands, you know, it's not necessarily very useful. And certainly one point about the compact cameras is you can get them into much more compact, tight spaces. And that's exactly what John showed with his sequence of pictures for the tadpole fish. He'd never have got that with some complex, elaborate, enormous 3 flashes, 2 torches DSLR. The fish would have gone, or he wouldn't have got in the right angle just to get into the gully where the fish was. So I'm just going to show you some pictures that Charlotte Bolton's taken locally using very much the same system that John had, a TG4 with a flash or a torch. And all of these photographs show you the essential features for that particular fish. Because this is a Sangoby group complex, so Sangoby rather than either. You can see that, I mean, certainly if you had the original image in front of you, you can see that the scales go right up to the front there, just behind the gill covers. So you know that's a Sangoby complex species. Black goby here, beautiful male, showing off its fins in a very nice way, but you can make out black sensory papillae on the head of the animal here, which tells you it's a black goby. Cooch's goby, again, this picture's got all the essential details. If you look at the original image, you can see the black spines on the first dorsal here. Obviously the colour's nice, silvery grey, all these nice spots down the side. So do look out for Cooch's goby. You really ought to have more records of it. We got lots of them in Portland Harbour, and despite Portland Harbour being a venue for lots of divers, I never get a record from anybody for a Cooch's goby. In fact, I think I once had one from Richard York from down Devon Way, and this one of Charlotte's here is pretty well the first I've had from somebody other than myself until recently. And then there's a whole group in Cornwall now who recognise them from the fowl. Charlotte's rock goby, you can see sort of silky rays here. Certainly you can in the original image. Nice orange line on the first dorsal, cheeky little face. You don't necessarily have to get in close with these fish. Got a nice Bayon's wrasse here with its nest, the characteristic nest with red seaweeds and lots of bits of shell and stuff stuck on the outside. And then if you go to the corkwing, even if this male wasn't here, you'd know that was a corkwing nest and not a Bayon's, because it's all weed. But again, the TG5 has produced a very good image of the fish with its nest. You know, it's a fish in context, which is often very useful behaviour feature to collect. And you don't need to be stuck with the really macro stuff here. We've got a good general view with pout and a male and female cuckoo wrasse. So I think my camera is not good enough, isn't an adequate excuse for not taking photographs of fish. If you don't want to do fish, that's fine, that's a different argument. But I think, you know, don't be put off by saying you haven't got a good enough camera. I'm sure if you've got a camera, it's good enough. And this is a brill. Okay, we haven't got the whole fish, but Charlotte's got the really important character here, which shows the separated fin rays just on the dorsal fin above the mouth here that distinguish it from a turbot. So, you know, you haven't got the whole fish, but because you know what character you need to identify it, Charlotte's got a close-up view of the right bit. and she need only have taken one picture of that fish. She needn't have blatted it for 20 shots just for that essential image to show which animal you've got. So where next? I would suggest, if you're looking at fish in Ireland, this is one of the best books to get hold of. Don't be put off by the word whales in it. It's the adjacent waters are perfectly adequate for the whole of England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland. It's got most of the fish that most of us would see on a dive in any of those places. I looked for it on Amazon and it seemed to be going for about 25 euros or more. But Seasearcher has quite a stock of them, and I think they should be able to do them for a competitive price. If you talk to Tony about it, perhaps we can arrange something. That's where I'd start. And then obviously there's endless internet resources. And I think they're going to put a list of some of the resources that I would suggest into chat or something, so you can pick that up. So, whistle-top tour through some fish. Does anybody have questions?